The aircraft carrier in the United States Navy did not arrive as an instant juggernaut. It evolved from experiments, treaty compromises, and relentless exercises that taught hard lessons at sea until the results were undeniable. And by the time America entered World War II, the foundations were strong enough that ships like Lexington and Yorktown could carry the fight beyond the horizon and quietly replace the battleship as the fleet's main striking arm. The starting point was USS Langley, CV-1, commissioned in 1922 from the converted collier Jupiter, a floating laboratory where pilots learned how to land on a moving runway using early arresting wires and how to launch into shifting winds without the help of sophisticated catapults. Langley's deck crews invented hand signals, deck markings, and safety routines that became muscle memory for a generation. Those procedures scaled up with the Washington Naval Treaty's loophole that allowed battlecruiser hulls to become carriers, and the United States seized it to produce USS Lexington, CV-2, and USS Saratoga, CV-3. Fast, long-legged ships that displaced over 30,000 tons, steamed above 30 knots, and carried air groups greater than many land airfields of the day. They were big enough to conduct simultaneous launch and recovery cycles, robust enough to sail with the battle line, and fast enough to outrun it. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, naval aviators like Joseph Bull Reeves, backed by visionaries such as Rear Admiral William Moffett, hammered out doctrine in annual fleet problems, large-scale war games that pushed carriers from mere scouts into independent strike platforms. During Fleet Problem 9 in 1929, Saratoga detached at speed and carried out a simulated surprise strike on the Panama Canal, forcing planners to admit that aircraft at sea could threaten the most fortified nodes in the Western Hemisphere. And in 1932 and again in 1938, exercises against Pearl Harbor exposed how a coordinated carrier air group could neutralize a major base before defenders fully reacted. The lessons were precise. Speed to get the wind, disciplined deck handling to convert minutes into sorties, and the necessity of layered protection combat air patrol overhead, picket destroyers on the ring, and fighters ready on deck that would later define wartime task forces. Alongside tactics came technology, from sturdier arresting gear and crash barriers to reliable radios that allowed real-time fighter direction and early shipboard radar sets, fitted to frontline carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown on the eve of war that gave precious minutes of warning against incoming raids. As aircraft matured, so did roles. Precision dive bombing became the Navy's scalpel, thanks to the SBD Dauntless with its perforated dive flaps and robust structure. Torpedo squadrons shouldered the burden of low-level strikes first with the TBD Devastator and then the tougher TBF-TBM Avenger, and fighters advanced from the outmatched F-2A Buffalo to the resilient F-4F Wildcat. The choreography that united them, search, strike, escort, recovery, was rehearsed in peacetime until it could be executed in heavy weather and fading light, because a carrier's true weapon was not any single airplane, but the cycle rate that turned a flight deck into a machine for projecting power again and again in a single day. Even so, through 1940, the battleship still dominated doctrine and budgets. Naval orthodoxy considered carriers the eyes of the fleet, the scouts that would help gunnery ships fight the decisive line of battle engagement, but events overseas eroded that assumption, most notably the Royal Navy's carrier strike on Taranto in November 1940, which crippled Italian battleships in their harbor and proved that aerial torpedoes and dive bombers could neutralize capital ships under the right conditions, a lesson noted in every naval staff college on Earth. When war reached the United States on December 7, 1941, Japanese carriers demonstrated the concept at scale. While the tragedy at Pearl Harbor destroyed much of the American battle line, the three Pacific Fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea and therefore intact. And with that twist of fate, the center of gravity shifted by necessity as well as logic. Aircraft at sea could not only scout and screen, but also deliver strategic effects with or without a friendly anchorage. In the weeks that followed, the small U.S. carrier force began to probe outward. Enterprise struck the Marshalls at Kwajalein and Hwacha on February 1, 1942, while Yorktown hit Jaluit and Mealy the same day. pinprick raids that caused modest damage but achieved two crucial outcomes: training crews in combat and forcing the Japanese to disperse assets to protect wide ocean spaces. These early strikes exposed practical truths that manuals only hinted at. Deck cycles had to be ruthlessly timed to get a full strike spotted, warmed, and launched between squalls. Returning planes needed disciplined landing intervals to avoid fouling the deck, and every gallon of aviation gasoline had to be handled with a safety culture that treated static sparks and hot exhausts as enemies. Because a carrier's strength, its concentration of fueled aircraft and ordnance, was also its vulnerability. Meanwhile, the Navy accelerated its learning curve in fighter direction. Radar scopes in shipboard combat information centers cued wildcats into cap intercepts, while radio nets carried vector calls and bogey reports, an elastic umbrella that could be shifted to meet incoming threats, and then reined back to clear the pattern for recovery. And this radar-directed fighter control, refined on ships like Enterprise and Yorktown, became a signature American advantage as 1942 unfolded. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 pushed the concept of sea-based air power even further in psychological terms. Hornet carried 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers to the launch point with Enterprise covering. And while the physical damage to Japan was small, the raid pierced the aura of invulnerability and forced the Japanese Navy to accelerate operations that would draw it into the kind of carrier duel where American strengths intelligence, repair, logistics, and a willingness to trust deck crews with fast, aggressive cycles could count. Even before that duel, the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 previewed the new age. Opposing fleets never traded gunfire because they never closed the range, and Lexington and Yorktown fought through the air alone. Lexington was lost after heroic damage control bought hours but not salvation, and Yorktown was battered. But the Japanese drive toward Port Moresby was checked, and both sides internalized the central message. What mattered in carrier warfare was who found whom first, who assembled and launched a coherent strike faster, and who protected their pilots with fighter escort and reliable rescue. This is the precise seam where carriers eclipsed battleships in American thinking. A battleship's big guns could reach 20 miles, maybe a little more. A carrier's air group could strike 300 miles away, scout in multiple directions at once, and do so repeatedly in a single day. And the ship itself could maneuver out of gunnery range while still exerting lethal effect. The unit of decision was no longer the salvo, but the sortie, and the command problem shifted from lineup and range to detection and timing. None of it would have mattered if the ships themselves had not been designed to sustain the tempo, and the Yorktown-class Yorktown, CV-5, Enterprise, CV-6, and Hornet, CV-8, proved they were. With high speed, long range, and efficient machinery arrangements, they supported high-intensity flight operations in blue water. Their hangars and elevators moved aircraft efficiently enough to spot full decks for strikes or cycle cap under pressure. And their damage control culture, welded into the force by relentless drills, gave them resilience under fire, as Enterprise would demonstrate repeatedly across 1942. A less visible but essential change came in how the Navy organized forces around the flattops. Rather than treat carriers as attachments to a battle line, the fleet formed carrier task forces, each centered on one or two carriers with a screen of cruisers and destroyers and, increasingly, fast battleships whose primary duty became anti-aircraft protection and night gunnery rather than chasing an enemy battle line. The protective ring evolved into a living system, with picket destroyers pushed out to radar range, cruiser directors controlling volume fire, and fighters weaving overhead while the carriers themselves steered to keep wind over the deck and to complicate torpedo solutions. And these habits of movement high speed, constant course adjustments, timed launches, made the task force itself the weapon rather than any one ship. Logistics quietly underwrote everything. Fleet oilers and the practice of underway replenishment matured during these early months so the carriers could remain on station, and mobile advance bases pushed aviation fuel, bombs, and spare engines forward. The result was operational endurance that kept pressure on the enemy and trained a pipeline of deck crews, ordnancemen, and mechanics who could turn aircraft around under tropical sun and monsoon rain. because sea control is as much about who can keep flying on day 3 and day 10 as who wins day 1. The culture aboard these ships completed the transition. Naval aviation placed responsibility down the chain, empowering landing signal officers to wave off unsafe approaches, trusting deck crews to make real-time calls on arming and fueling priorities, and relying on squadron leaders to adjust tactics in the air when weather, scattering, or enemy maneuvers scrambled the neat lines of a planning board, and that bias for decentralized decision-making meshed with the carrier's need to react at the speed of a cockpit rather than the deliberation of a plotting room. By mid-1942, the evidence that carriers had supplanted battleships as the decisive fleet instruments was stacked high even before the famous turning point to come. Raids across the Central Pacific spreading confusion, Coral Sea halting a major thrust without a line of battle engagement, and the very fact of survival at Pearl Harbor because the flattops were at sea. The Navy reflected those facts back into procurement by accelerating carrier construction. But even before new ships arrived in numbers, the existing force showed what doctrine plus training could do. Lexington's legacy was not just her size, but her speed and the way she taught airgroup coordination. Yorktown's legacy was the proof that a well-handled carrier could absorb damage, recover, and fight again within days. Hornet's legacy included the audacity to make a platform do something no one had designed it to do in the Doolittle raid, a demonstration of strategic reach that belongs in the story of how carriers became instruments of national policy rather than just fleet weapons. Key individuals pressed the evolution. Chester Nimitz, a submariner by background, backed carriers as the flexible arm that could seize initiative across the Pacific. William Halsey drove his task forces hard and accepted weather and fatigue as trade-offs for surprise. Raymond Spruance, often seen as cautious, understood the arithmetic of flight deck cycles and conserved air strength for the decisive moment, and below decks, chiefs and petty officers translated doctrine into the practical details of fueling, arming, spotting, and repairing, because a carrier's combat power is the product of thousands of right actions performed at tempo. The final step in this birth phase was conceptual and irreversible. The recognition that the carrier's striking power could be concentrated or dispersed at will through the simple act of massing ships. 2 carriers could coordinate their launches to deliver a larger, better escorted punch than either alone, and 3 or 4 could create a continuous cycle where one deck recovered while another launched and a third had cap in hand. And those techniques, sketched in fleet problems and tested in early 1942 operations, would become the heartbeat of wartime groups like the Fast Carriers, later known as Task Force 548. Even now, in this formative chapter, the logic was set. When fleets fight through their aircraft, the side that manages detection, timing, and deck cycles with the least friction holds the advantage. Thus, the birth of the carrier fleet was not a single date or a single ship. It was a chain of cause and effect stretching from Langley's tentative landings to Lexington and Saratoga's demonstration of speed and mass, from Yorktown-class efficiency to the disciplined chaos of combat air patrols and strike packages, from peacetime fleet problems to the first real battles at sea where ships never traded shells, and yet one side lost decisively. It was the moment when range became the currency of naval power, when scouts became strikers, when air groups replaced gun batteries as the heart of a fleet. By the summer of 1942, every captain in the Pacific understood that the carrier was now the critical node to protect, the instrument that could decide a campaign with a single day of good scouting and coherent strikes, and that understanding, forged by practice and proven in blood, is what truly replaced the battleship at the center of American sea power. The Battle of Midway was not simply a clash of fleets in June 1942. It was the defining moment when the United States Navy's carrier force, still young and relatively small, demonstrated that naval air power had become the ultimate arbiter of sea control. 4 Japanese carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, faced 3 American carriers, hurriedly repaired, understrengthened aircraft, and manned by crews that had been learning by doing for 6 brutal months. Yet within 4 days, the balance of the Pacific shifted irreversibly. Understanding Midway means understanding how intelligence, timing, doctrine, and sheer human resilience converged on a remote atoll to decide the future of the Pacific War. By the spring of 1942, Japan still held the initiative. Its forces had swept across the western Pacific, from Malaya and the Philippines to the Solomons. The Coral Sea in May had been a strategic check, but Japan still possessed overwhelming carrier superiority. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, seeking to destroy America's remaining flattops before industrial might could tilt the scales, devised an elaborate plan. Lure the Americans into defending Midway Atoll, a speck of land that served as the westernmost bastion of Hawaii, and annihilate their fleet with massed carrier strikes and battleship gunfire waiting in ambush. On paper, the plan carried the momentum of earlier Japanese successes. In practice, it demanded secrecy, coordination, and the element of surprise. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts at Station Haipo had broken portions of the Japanese naval code JN-25. Through painstaking work, they identified AF as Midway. By late May, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew where and when the Japanese would strike, and he positioned his only available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown north and east of Midway, ready to ambush the ambushers. Yorktown's presence was itself a story of speed and determination. Damaged at Coral Sea, she limped back to Pearl Harbor, her hull pierced, her flight deck battered. Estimates said she needed 3 months in the yard. Nimitz demanded her ready in 3 days. Navy Yard workers swarmed over her, patching steel, rigging cables, welding plates. By May 30th, she was sailing with an air group that had been scraped together from replacements, a symbol of the Navy's resolve. Alongside her were Enterprise and Hornet, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, stepping in for the ailing Halsey, with task forces shielded by cruisers and destroyers. Together, these 3 carriers fielded about 233 aircraft. Facing them, the Japanese First Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo deployed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu with nearly 260 planes, supported by powerful battleships and cruisers. By weight of numbers, Japan still held the advantage. The battle opened on June 4, 1942, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Midway Island itself. Fighters and bombers swooped down on the atoll's runways, fuel tanks and anti-aircraft guns. Marine pilots flying outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats fought desperately. Many cut down by Zero escorts, but they inflicted losses and bought time. Midway's runways remained usable, and its defenders still in the fight. While bombs fell on the atoll, waves of American aircraft were already in the air. From Midway itself, Army B-17s and Marine dive bombers and torpedo planes launched in piecemeal attacks, forcing Japanese combat air patrol to stay aloft and burning fuel. Their attacks scored no hits, but they kept pressure on Nagumo's decks. The decisive drama unfolded at sea. American carrier groups, still trying to locate the Japanese, launched their torpedo squadrons first. From Hornet came Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Flying obsolete TBD Devastators, slow and poorly armed, they pressed on without fighter escort. One by one, they were shot down by Zeros or torn apart by anti-aircraft fire. Of 30 planes, only 1 pilot survived. Similar fates befell Yorktown's and Enterprise's torpedo squadrons. It was a massacre, and for a moment it seemed as if courage alone would not suffice. Yet their sacrifice pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level and scattered them into chaotic engagements. At that exact moment, the dive bombers arrived. Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had struggled to find the enemy. Running low on fuel, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding to rejoin the fleet and followed it. The decision brought his squadrons directly over Nagumo's carriers. From altitude, with Japanese fighters chasing torpedo planes low on the horizon and decks crowded with fueled aircraft and armed bombs, the American dive bombers attacked. At 10:22 a.m., in the space of 5 minutes, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were struck with precision. Bombs tore into hangars, igniting gasoline and ordnance. Explosions consumed crews and planes. Firefighting systems were overwhelmed. Within hours, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally stricken. Only Hiryu remained, and she struck back hard. 2 counterattacks launched against Yorktown succeeded in scoring hits, crippling her engines and flight deck. Damage control teams fought valiantly, restoring power long enough for her to continue operating aircraft. But a second strike left her dead in the water. Eventually, she had to be abandoned. Yet Yorktown's ordeal absorbed the enemy's fury and bought the other carriers freedom to continue the fight. In the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located Hiryu and attacked. Their bombs left her burning uncontrollably, and by nightfall, she too was finished. The tally was stark. Japan lost 4 frontline fleet carriers and over 250 aircraft, along with irreplaceable veteran aircrews trained since before the war. The United States lost Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and around 150 aircraft. Strategically, the Japanese advance halted. Midway remained in American hands. More importantly, the initiative shifted. No longer could Japan launch deep offensive thrusts with carrier power. From June 1942 onward, they would fight on the defensive, their striking arm shattered. Midway's significance went beyond numbers. It demonstrated the decisive role of intelligence code-breaking had set the stage. It confirmed the doctrine of the carrier task force striking from beyond gun range, massing aircraft for concentrated blows and dispersing at sea to avoid annihilation. It also underscored the human dimension, the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons that absorbed losses so dive bombers could deliver the decisive blow, the judgment of commanders like Nimitz and Spruance, who accepted risk to seize opportunity, and the resilience of crews who repaired flight decks under fire. The Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet proved that a well-handled carrier could alter the course of a war in a single day. The Japanese Navy never fully recovered from Midway. Shipyards could replace carriers, but training programs could not replace the lost aviators quickly enough. The United States, by contrast, had begun to unleash its industrial might. Essex-Class Carriers were already under construction. Midway was thus more than a battle. It was the hinge of the Pacific War. In June 1942, 3 battered American carriers turned the tide against 4 powerful Japanese flattops. They did it with intelligence, doctrine, and sacrifice, and in doing so, they demonstrated that the age of the battleship was over. From that day forward, the aircraft carrier would not only dominate naval warfare, but also symbolize American sea power. This was the turning point, a battle fought and won by the carrier arm, where the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet carried the weight of the Pacific on their wooden decks and proved that naval history had changed forever. The Essex-Class Carrier was more than a ship. It was an industrial response to a strategic crisis, a blueprint for how the United States would transform a handful of fragile flattops into a relentless striking force that could sweep the Pacific from one end to the other. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the narrow victories at Coral Sea and Midway, it was clear that survival depended on numbers, endurance, and standardization. The Yorktown class had proven what a well-handled carrier could achieve, but they were few, and the attrition rate in 1942 showed how easily the balance could swing. The Essex class was conceived to ensure that never again would the U.S. Navy face a superior carrier force. Authorized under the Two-Ocean Navy Act of July 1940, before America had even entered the war, the Essex class represented foresight and scale. Each displaced 27 out of the 100-ton standard, 36,000 at full load, and stretched 872 feet in length. More importantly, they were designed from the keel up as carriers, not conversions or treaty-limited compromises. Their flight decks were wide enough to handle larger aircraft, their hangars open enough for rapid spotting, and their machinery powerful enough to steam at over 30 knots. They were not the largest ships afloat, but they struck the balance between capability, production speed, and adaptability. The Navy ordered them in numbers unprecedented in naval history. By war's end, 24 Essex-class carriers had entered service, with more under construction. At peak wartime pace, American shipyards delivered one Essex every few months. This was not a miracle of craftsmanship, but of mass production. Modular construction, standardized parts, and an industrial base that had already mastered building thousands of Liberty ships and destroyer escorts. Shipyards in Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and elsewhere worked around the clock, turning blueprints into steel realities at a pace the Axis could never match. Technically, the Essex class incorporated innovations that made them superior fighting platforms. The flight deck, while still wooden over steel framing, was strengthened to handle repeated landings of heavy aircraft. The elevators were larger and more powerful, capable of moving bombers and torpedo planes quickly between hangar and deck. The arresting gear was improved, allowing faster recovery cycles. Their island superstructure was compact and functional, with state-of-the-art radar arrays that extended early warning ranges and directed fighter defenses with precision. Below decks, aviation fuel systems were redesigned with better protection, inert gas systems, and stronger bulkheads to reduce the catastrophic fires that had plagued earlier carriers. Capacity was their most obvious strength, and Essex typically carried 90 to 100 aircraft fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, more than any Yorktown could manage. By 1944, as aircraft evolved, their decks operated growing numbers of F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBM Avengers, a powerful trio that gave the task force reach, punch, and resilience. The Hellcat in particular, rugged and forgiving, allowed the Navy to train thousands of new pilots rapidly, and from Essex decks it achieved kill ratios that turned the tide in the air war. But technology alone did not explain their impact. The Essex class enabled a new style of operations. With carriers available in such numbers, the Navy created the Fast Carrier Task Force, a mobile strike arm that could move thousands of miles, hit anywhere, and then disappear before the enemy could respond. Task Force 58, later Task Force 38 under Halsey and Spruance, was built around groups of Essex-class carriers operating together, usually 3 to 4 per task group, supported by light carriers and a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This concentration meant hundreds of aircraft could be launched in coordinated waves, overwhelming defenses and saturating skies. It also meant the force could sustain operations indefinitely, as one group retired to refuel and replenish while another struck. The carrier became not just a ship but part of a system, and the Essex was the standardized core of that system. The flexibility of the design also mattered. Essex carriers absorbed new technology as the war progressed. Improved radar suites directed fighters with increasing accuracy. Combat information centers, the nerve centers of radar plotting and communications, expanded in sophistication. Anti-aircraft defenses grew heavier, with quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts and 20mm Oerlikons bristling on sponsons, creating a defensive envelope that made kamikaze attacks costly and uncertain. Armored flight decks, adopted in British carriers, were not part of the original Essex design, but the American emphasis on offensive capacity, larger air groups, faster turnaround proved justified in the Pacific, where offensive pressure was decisive. The industrial scale of the Essex program was as important as the technical details. Each ship represented millions of man-hours, tens of thousands of tons of steel, and a supply chain that extended across the continent. Engines built in the Midwest, guns from New England, radar from California, all converged at the yards. By late 1943, as the first Essexes arrived in the Pacific, USS Essex herself, along with Bunker Hill, Yorktown, CV-10, Lexington, CV-16, and others, the Navy shifted from surviving battle to dictating tempo. With Essex carriers, the fleet no longer had to gamble everything on a handful of ships. Losses, while painful, could be absorbed because more were arriving. It was industrial depth translated into combat power. The revolution they brought was tactical as well as strategic. Before Essex, strikes had to be carefully husbanded, and recovery cycles meant vulnerability between waves. With multiple Essex carriers in a task group, operations overlapped. While one recovered, another launched, and a third maintained combat air patrol. This constant presence in the air smothered Japanese counterattacks and allowed the U.S. Navy to strike targets repeatedly in a single day, something the Japanese, with fewer carriers and dwindling trained pilots, could not match. By 1944, the Essex-class was everywhere in the Pacific, spearheading assaults from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, and beyond. They were the hammer that supported amphibious landings, the shield that denied the enemy skies, and the sword that destroyed enemy fleets when they dared to appear. They were not perfect deck-edge elevators, and armored decks would come in later designs, but they were good enough, and they were there in numbers, which mattered more than perfection. The Essex-class was, in essence, the industrial embodiment of American strategy. They were designed to be produced fast, operated by thousands of citizen sailors trained in months, and adaptable to whatever the war required. Each one was a floating airfield, capable of projecting force hundreds of miles in any direction, and together they became the rolling tide that drowned the Japanese Empire's sea power. The revolution they represented was not a secret weapon or a brilliant tactical trick, but the systematic application of industry, engineering, and doctrine. By the end of the war, the Essex-class had proven themselves as the most successful carrier design of World War II. They fought in every major Pacific campaign, absorbed damage that would have sunk earlier ships, launched strikes that destroyed enemy fleets, and provided the backbone of American naval power into the Cold War. They were not glamorous like a single decisive battle, but they were decisive by their very existence, numerous, reliable, and relentless. In the Essex-class, the United States built not just ships, but a strategy of overwhelming, sustained carrier warfare that ensured victory in the Pacific and established the model of naval power projection for generations to come. This was the Essex-class Revolution. Mass production married to doctrine, turning steel and machinery into an unstoppable fleet that changed not only the war but the future of naval warfare itself. Carrier warfare in the Pacific after 1943 was not a matter of individual duels or single strikes. It was the sustained, systematic projection of air power over thousands of miles of ocean, and it reached its peak in the campaigns for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. By then, the Essex-class carriers had entered service in strength, and with them came the transformation of naval war from a contest of a few fragile decks into an industrial offensive that never paused. The Fourth Fleet of Carriers, sometimes known as the Fast Carrier Task Force, could move anywhere in the Pacific and bring with it a mobile air force larger than many nations possessed. This was the moment when carriers became not just the main force of the fleet, but the indispensable foundation of every operation, from sea battles to amphibious landings. The reconquest of the Philippines in late 1944 demonstrated what carrier power could do when concentrated. In October, U.S. forces returned to Leyte, and Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey built around Essex-class carriers like Essex, Lexington, Intrepid, Franklin, and Enterprise covered the invasion. Japanese planners committed to a decisive battle, sending nearly their entire remaining surface fleet into what became the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here, American carrier aircraft proved they were not just support, but the decisive striking arm. On October 24th, waves of carrier planes overwhelmed Japanese defenses in the Sibuyan Sea. Musashi, one of the two largest battleships ever built, was hammered relentlessly by bombs and torpedoes from carrier squadrons until she capsized and sank. At the same time, carrier aircraft crippled other battleships and cruisers, softening the enemy before they even reached the invasion beaches. The following day brought another demonstration of carrier power. Off Cape Engano, American carriers launched massive strikes that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. These ships, many stripped of trained air groups, had been used as bait to draw Halsey north. Instead, they became burning wrecks under the concentrated blows of Essex-class air groups. At Leyte, carrier planes did what had once been thought the task of the battle line. They destroyed enemy capital ships, scattered the fleet, and ensured that no serious challenge to the invasion remained. Yet, Leyte was more than a fleet battle. For months afterward, carriers provided air support to ground forces across the Philippines. Their aircraft suppressed Japanese airfields, intercepted reinforcements, and struck shipping trying to resupply garrisons. For Filipino civilians and American troops alike, the constant drone of American planes overhead symbolized liberation. For the Japanese, it meant there was no safe haven anywhere within the islands. This was carrier warfare as a campaign tool, sustained, overwhelming, and flexible enough to strike fleets one day and villages the next. From the Philippines, the carrier arm pushed closer to Japan. In February 1945, American forces assaulted Iwo Jima, a volcanic fortress defended by thousands of entrenched troops. Carriers were central to both preparation and execution. In the days before the landings, fast carrier task groups launched repeated raids, hitting not only Iwo Jima itself, but also Japanese airfields on the home islands to prevent reinforcements. Once the Marines stormed the beaches, carrier planes shifted to close air support. Avengers and Helldivers bombed pillboxes, Hellcats strafed trenches, and rocket-armed fighters blasted caves. Forward air controllers on the ground spoke directly to pilots overhead, guiding strikes onto targets just yards in front of Marine lines. This coordination between carriers and ground forces was a new dimension of naval warfare. Air power delivered from the sea, precise enough to shape the battlefield hour by hour. Iwo Jima was also a logistical test. Carriers had to maintain air superiority not for days but for weeks, and the ability to refuel and resupply at sea became critical. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels rendezvoused with carriers hundreds of miles from shore, transferring fuel hoses and cargo while ships steamed in parallel. This underway replenishment allowed the task force to remain on station indefinitely, a revolutionary concept that made possible the long, grinding operations of 1945. The ultimate trial came at Okinawa. Beginning in April 1945, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War unfolded, supported by the greatest concentration of carriers in history. Task Force 58, later 38, brought together more than a dozen Essex-Class Carriers and Leyte carriers, forming a floating airfield complex capable of launching over 1,000 aircraft. The Japanese response was ferocious. Unable to match American production, they turned to desperation. The kamikaze. Hundreds of suicide aircraft hurled themselves at the fleet, and carriers were prime targets. Bunker Hill was struck on May 11th by 2 kamikazes in quick succession. Gasoline fires swept the decks, bombs exploded among parked planes, and nearly 400 men were killed. Yet even this catastrophe did not sink her. Damage control teams fought through smoke and flame, and the ship, though badly hurt, survived to steam home. Franklin suffered one of the worst attacks of the war when bombs detonated on her hangar deck in March, killing more than 700, yet her crew saved her and brought her back under her own power. These ordeals showed the resilience of the Essex-class and the determination of their crews. Unlike earlier carriers, which might have been lost to single hits, the newer ships could absorb terrible punishment and still survive. Meanwhile, the rest of the task force continued operations without pause. Radar pickets, destroyers stationed far from the fleet, provided early warning of incoming raids. Combat air patrols of Hellcats and Corsairs intercepted attackers before they reached the carriers. Those that got through faced a storm of anti-aircraft fire from cruisers, battleships, and the carriers themselves, whose decks bristled with 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. Even when kamikazes struck, replacements were already on station. The system was elastic. Losses could be endured because the overall fleet was so numerous and its logistics so deep. At Okinawa, carriers not only defended themselves, they enabled the land battle. For 3 months, their aircraft provided constant support, blasting ridgelines, suppressing counterattacks, and cutting Japanese supply lines. They also struck the Japanese homeland directly, hitting Kyushu airfields to reduce the kamikaze threat. In effect, the fleet created a bubble of air superiority that extended hundreds of miles, allowing the Army and Marines to grind forward under cover. Without the carriers, Okinawa would have been impossible. With them, it was brutal but ultimately successful. By the summer of 1945, the system was perfected. Fast carrier task forces could range the Japanese home islands at will. In July, waves of Essex-class aircraft struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Kure, and Kobe. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers supported with shore bombardment, but it was the carriers that provided the continuous hammer. Even as B-29s flew from Saipan and Tinian, the Navy's mobile airfields ensured that Japanese industry, transport, and morale came under constant pressure. The cumulative effect of these campaigns was decisive. Japanese fleets were sunk, air power destroyed, and homeland defenses eroded. Amphibious operations that once would have seemed impossible, assaulting island fortresses defended by thousands, were now routine, because carriers guaranteed dominance overhead. They provided not just striking power, but the ability to sustain operations for weeks, refuel at sea, and recover from losses without interruption. Carrier warfare in the Pacific thus reached its full expression between 1944 and 1945. It was a system. Essex-class carriers providing decks, aircraft like Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers providing firepower, logistics ships providing fuel and ordnance, and command structures orchestrating everything into relentless pressure. From Leyte Gulf to Okinawa, this system crushed the Japanese Navy, supported invasions, and paved the way for victory. What had begun in 1942 as a desperate struggle with 3 surviving carriers had, by 1945, become an unstoppable tide of flattops sweeping across the Pacific. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each showed how carriers dominated the sky, shielded the fleet, and made amphibious conquest possible. In those campaigns, the aircraft carrier ceased to be an experiment or even a weapon among many. It became the defining instrument of modern naval war, a role it has never surrendered. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the aircraft carriers that had fought their way across the Pacific faced an uncertain future. They had carried the United States from the desperate days after Pearl Harbor to the very doorstep of Japan. But what would become of them in peace? The answer is that their legacy reached far beyond the war itself. The carriers of World War II, especially the Essex class, not only secured victory, but also laid the foundation for the modern U.S. Navy and the global role it continues to play. The immediate post-war years saw dozens of carriers in service, but the United States no longer needed such a massive wartime fleet. Many Essex-class ships were decommissioned and placed in reserve, forming the mothball fleet that lined harbors from San Diego to Norfolk. Their wooden flight decks and unarmored hulls were not ideal for peacetime operations, but they represented a bank of potential power ready to be reactivated if needed. Some, like USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill, were too badly damaged in kamikaze attacks to return to service and were scrapped. Others, like Enterprise, which had fought from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, were retired with honors. Enterprise herself was scrapped in 1960, but her name lived on in new carriers that followed. Yet the Essex class did not vanish with the peace. Many were modernized under programs that replaced wooden flight decks with armored steel, added angled decks to allow jets to take off and land more safely, and upgraded catapults, radar, and arresting gear. Ships like USS Oriskany, USS Intrepid, and USS Lexington served for decades, transitioning from piston-engine aircraft to jets, from World War II squadrons to Cold War strike wings. They fought again in Korea, providing close air support to Marines and Army troops, and later in Vietnam, launching sorties deep into Southeast Asia. Some Essex carriers remained in service into the 1970s, a testament to the durability of their design and the foresight of their builders. The legacy of the World War II carriers was not just the steel they carried, but the doctrine they created. The Fast Carrier Task Force of 1944 evolved directly into the carrier strike groups of the Cold War. The principles were the same. Concentrate air power at sea, use mobile bases to project force without reliance on foreign territory, and protect the fleet with layers of escorts and aircraft. The ability to strike targets hundreds of miles inland from the sea became the defining feature of American power. Battleships faded into obsolescence, kept as gunfire, support ships, or museums, while carriers became the visible symbol of U.S. presence around the world. Culturally, the carriers became icons. USS Enterprise was called the Gray Ghost for her repeated returns after being reported sunk. USS Hornet carried Doolittle's raiders and launched strikes at Midway before being lost in 1942. USS Yorktown fought to the end at Midway, her battered deck supporting dive bombers that changed the course of history. Each name carried forward into new ships, linking generations of sailors and aviators. The tradition of naming carriers after great battles, presidents, and historic ships reinforced their symbolic role as floating cities of American might. The legacy also extended to allies and adversaries. Britain, having pioneered carrier aviation, adapted American techniques, modernized her own carriers, and later developed angled decks that U.S. ships adopted. The Soviet Union, observing the overwhelming effectiveness of American carriers, pursued its own naval aviation programs, though never on the same scale. Japan, once a carrier power itself, built helicopter carriers and light flattops in later decades, but always with the memory of 1942-45 in mind. Around the world, the lesson of the Pacific War was clear. The aircraft carrier was the ultimate instrument of naval power. Domestically, the carriers shaped the U.S. Navy for generations. The carrier navy became the dominant school of thought, shaping budgets, shipbuilding, and strategy. Submarines gained importance in the nuclear age, but surface fleets revolved around the carrier. Every major crisis from Korea to Vietnam, from the Taiwan Strait to the Persian Gulf, saw American carriers on the horizon, their air wings ready to strike. This role derived directly from the experience of World War II, when carriers had proven they could fight, survive, and win across the largest ocean in the world. Even in memory, the legacy endures. Several Essex-class ships survive today as museums. USS Intrepid rests in New York Harbor as the centerpiece of the Intrepid Sea Air Space Museum. USS Yorktown is preserved at Patriots Point in South Carolina. USS Lexington sits in Corpus Christi, Texas, still towering above the water as a reminder of what American industry and courage achieved. Visitors walk their decks and imagine the days when those wooden planks shook under the roar of Hellcats launching into the Pacific sky. These preserved ships are not just memorials, they are classrooms, teaching new generations the cost of freedom and the power of innovation. Strategically, the World War II carriers reshaped the map. The Pacific Islands where they fought, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, became stepping stones of history. But their true significance was that they proved mobility could conquer distance. No fortress, no fleet, no island was safe when carriers could appear offshore, launch hundreds of aircraft, and vanish again over the horizon. That concept, born of necessity in 1942 and perfected by 1945, became the foundation of American global reach in the decades that followed. Their story is also a story of people. Pilots who took off into stormy skies, deck crews who fueled and armed aircraft in minutes under fire, damage control teams who fought fires in dark, smoke-filled compartments, all left their mark on naval history. The ships were steel, but the men were flesh and blood, and together they forged a system that defeated an empire. When we speak of Essex, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, we are not only recalling ships but the thousands who served aboard them, many never to return. Their legacy lives on in every carrier that sails today, each one a direct descendant of the flattops that fought across the Pacific. By the time Japan surrendered, the aircraft carrier had gone from experiment to centerpiece. It had replaced the battleship in the line of battle, redefined strategy, and set the template for future wars. Its legacy after World War II was nothing less than the foundation of American sea power, the guarantee that the United States could project force anywhere in the world. That legacy endures in the nuclear-powered carriers of today, but its roots are in the Essex-class decks where young pilots once roared into the sky over the Pacific. The carriers that changed history did more than win a war. They created a new world order, one where sea power meant air power, and where the United States Navy would sail not just as a national fleet, but as a global force. Their wooden decks are gone, their veterans have aged, but their story is written in every corner of the Pacific, in every preserved museum ship, and in every modern carrier strike group. If you've watched this far, you now know how the carriers of World War II reshaped history, how they carried America from survival to victory, and how their legacy endures in every modern flat top. To support more deep dive history like this, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. And in the comments, let us know, which of the great World War II carriers do you think had the most important role? Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, or Essex? We'd love to hear your thoughts.